less than 15 minutes, a narrow strip of trees in eastern Ukraine turned from cover into a killing maze, where one side thought the fight was already over. Russian artillery smashed the trenches first, then assault troops pushed into the tree line under smoke and grenades, hunting for exhausted Ukrainian soldiers who were low on ammo and cut off from help. A single M113 tried to punch through and rescue them, but the vehicle hit a mine, lurched into a tree, and left its crew on foot in the worst place on the map. From there, the battle turned into a live test of modern war, with Western-built Bradley fighting vehicles, cheap attack drones, and old Soviet-style infantry tactics all colliding inside that same strip of ground. This video breaks down what really happened in that tree line, what it says about the wider war in Ukraine, and why small actions like this matter far beyond one village. If you want clear, straight talk about weapons, battles, and the politics behind them, like this video, share it, and subscribe to Military Force. Russian forces opened this phase of the battle by turning a narrow strip of trees into a target grid for their guns, because they wanted to shake the Ukrainian defense before any soldier stepped forward. Shells landed in tight patterns along the wood line and over the trenches, throwing soil, splinters, and metal fragments across firing positions in a way that made simple movement feel dangerous. Each impact sent shockwaves through the earth, and the repeated blasts slowly cut away branches, cover, and any sense that the front line was a stable place to stand. The barrage also drowned out radio calls and made it hard for small Ukrainian teams to hear orders, so confusion started to grow even before enemy infantry came close. Russian planners used this heavy fire not only to damage bunkers and dugouts, but also to push defenders into cover, since soldiers with their heads down cannot watch the approaches. When the guns finally paused, assault groups moved in under a blanket of smoke, using the haze to hide from Ukrainian optics, thermal sights, and any drone that might still be in the air. These units advanced in short rushes, hugged the ground, and threw grenades into trench mouths and small shelters, trying to force every hidden defender to move or scream. Team leaders called out distances, pointed to gaps in the line, and sent pairs of men to climb into each section of the earthwork with rifles ready and fingers tight on their triggers. They worked methodically along the strip of cover, stepping over broken timber and loose boards, and checked every bend, corner, and firing slit because any missed opening could hide a man with a loaded weapon. The idea was simple but brutal, since a slow and careful cleaning of the position, meter by meter, left little room for surprise and gave the attackers growing confidence with each empty hole they cleared. On the Ukrainian side of the same ground, the picture looked very different because the defenders were few in number, tired from earlier clashes, and short on ammunition after a long period of holding the line. Some soldiers tried to ration their last magazines, counting rounds in their heads while they picked targets, and they knew that once the belts and boxes ran dry, only retreat or capture would remain. One fighter reported over the radio that he had been hit and could not stay in the firing line, and a field commander passed the word up that the unit needed support or risked losing the entire position. This pattern of heavy shelling followed by close assault has appeared again and again on the Eastern Front, where Russian forces trade ammunition and manpower for slow gains along the trench network. Ukrainian commanders watching this sector understood that without fresh support, these small groups would face a hard choice between staying in place and being overrun, or pulling back and giving up ground that had cost lives to hold. That is the point in a battle where armored vehicles and rescue attempts become the only way to change the story on a dying line, and that is exactly what came next along this battered strip of trees. Ukraine tried to break the pressure on the trenches by sending in an M113, because commanders knew that fresh ammo and a way out were the only things that could save the men in that tree line. The tracked vehicle rolled toward the wood line along a route that looked like the safest corridor, but its weight crossed a hidden mine belt that had been laid earlier on that same approach. The blast hit under the hull, lifted the front, and slammed the machine sideways, so the driver lost control and the vehicle crashed into a tree instead of reaching the dug-in infantry. There was no giant fireball, yet the undercarriage and running gear took serious damage, and it was clear that this armored carrier would not move again under its own power. The crew climbed out in shock, checked each other for wounds, and then ran for whatever cover they could find, because they knew that a stopped vehicle on a known track would soon draw more fire. For Ukraine, the loss of that M113 on this axis was more than one damaged hull, since this type of carrier has been used as a flexible workhorse to move troops, bring supplies, and evacuate wounded under threat. When a multi-role asset like that dies in a minefield, the local plan for rescue, resupply, and rotation falls apart, and the soldiers back in the trench understand at once that help will be slower and more dangerous. While the wreck still smoked, small Ukrainian groups inside the tree line started to pull back on foot because they could feel Russian squads closing in from different angles. These men crawled through brush and broken branches, kept their bodies close to the ground, and tried to use every fold in the terrain to stay out of sight from anyone watching from above. Even with careful movement, they could not escape the new reality of this war, since a Russian drone was already circling above the area and scanning for any sign of motion under the leaves. The operator watched shadows shift between trunks, marked shapes that did not match the wind, and then passed exact coordinates back to artillery units waiting behind the front. Guns on the Russian side answered fast, and shells began to land along the narrow path where the Ukrainian soldiers were trying to slip away, turning their quiet retreat into another deadly zone. Shrapnel tore through branches and dry soil, and at least one fighter was hit badly enough that he could no longer stand, so his comrades had to leave him in place and report his condition over the radio. The call for help carried a mix of calm code words and the tight edge of fear, because everyone on that channel knew that moving a stretcher across mined ground under a hostile drone would be almost impossible. By this point, the trapped groups were squeezed between a tree line where Russian troops already held some positions, a mine belt that blocked vehicle access, and a sky controlled by enemy sensors and blast patterns. This is what a modern kill zone looks like when mines stop armor, unmanned eyes find exposed men, and artillery finishes the job, and it shows how control of the air and the ground grid now shapes every meter of battlefield space. In a situation like that, the only way to change the odds is to bring in a tougher fighting vehicle with better protection and stronger firepower, and that role would soon fall to Bradley. The turning point came when a Bradley fighting vehicle rolled toward the tree line, because this machine arrived after the M113 was lost and the infantry were running out of options. The crew knew they could not just drive in alone, so Ukrainian guns first hammered the edge of the wood with high explosives and cluster rounds to push Russian heads down and break their aim. This short but violent curtain of fire carved gaps into the tree line, shook assault groups that had moved forward, and bought a narrow window in which a rescue run might still succeed. Under that cover, the Bradley drove up to the outer edge of the trees, using its armor as a shield and its sensors to pick out likely firing points along the dark shapes of the branches. The 25mm cannon then opened up in short bursts, stitching rounds along the front of the woods and into suspected positions where Russian soldiers might be watching the open ground. Each burst kicked up splinters and dust, and the steady rhythm of the gunfire made it harder for enemy shooters to lean out of their cover and line up clear shots on the exposed approach. Behind that steel screen, Ukrainian commanders told the exhausted defenders to fall back toward a segment of trench closer to the open side, because that spot gave the Bradley a place to pull alongside. Small groups moved in short sprints from hole to hole, carrying wounded men and dragging their remaining gear, while the vehicle kept pouring fire into the tree line to discourage any attempt at pursuit. When the first cluster reached the planned pickup point, the Bradley eased back toward the trench, turned slightly to angle its hull between the troops and the woods, and dropped the rear ramp without delay. Soldiers climbed aboard in seconds, pushing each other inside, lifting injured comrades, and using every bit of space behind the armor, since they understood that every extra moment in that zone invited new fire. As soon as the last man cleared the ramp, the hatch came up, the driver shifted into reverse, and the Bradley backed out fast across the rough ground, still firing bursts to keep the enemy pinned. The whole move showed how this vehicle could act like a moving wall, because it not only carried people but also blocked lines of sight and soaked up danger that would have killed unprotected troops. Unlike the M113, which is mainly a simple armored carrier, the Bradley brings thicker armor, a powerful main gun, and better night and thermal optics, so it can fight while it rescues under harsh conditions. Frontline reports have often described this exact style of use, with Bradleys racing up to forward trenches, blasting enemy dugouts at close range, and then loading or dropping off infantry in half a minute. In this battle, the first mission for the vehicle was not to storm positions or grab land, but to pull veteran soldiers out of a trap, because keeping trained fighters alive matters as much as holding a strip of ground. For viewers, this scene turns the Bradley from a line on a defense budget into a visible tool that protects lives and carries weight at the front, rather than just a showpiece in exercises. Once those men were back behind safer lines, the same machine and its sisters were ready to play a very different role. And that is where the story moves from rescue to organized counterattack. Ukraine shifted from rescue to offense when several Bradleys lined up for a planned pushback into the same tree line. Commanders understood that they could not let Russian troops dig in deeper, so they turned the rescue vehicle into the spearhead of a combined strike. Before the armored column moved, Ukrainian units laid down thick smoke across the front because they wanted to blind both ground observers and the drones that had hunted their men earlier. White and gray clouds rolled over the forward edge of the woods, hiding exact positions and making it harder for Russian gunners to pick out shapes on the open ground. Behind this cover, artillery batteries fired blocking missions to the rear and flanks of the tree line, using pre-planned target points to cut likely routes for movement, resupply, or withdrawal. These shells did not aim at the same trenches that infantry would soon enter, but instead focused on crossroads, hedges, and small clearings where enemy groups might form up. With those layers in place, the Bradleys advanced again toward the strip of trees, this time not to evacuate soldiers but to drop off assault teams under their guns. The vehicles used staggered positions in short bounds, stopping just long enough to let gunners sweep the front with bursts from the 25mm cannon. Each burst punched into the dark edges of the wood, forcing any Russian fighter near the rim to stay low or risk being hit before the infantry even arrived. When the lead vehicles reached their chosen points, the rear ramps slammed down and Ukrainian troops rushed out in small squads, heading straight for trench lines they had marked on earlier maps. These soldiers moved with a simple sequence that has become common on this front, because they knew that grenades and speed matter more in a trench than long exchanges of fire. They tossed grenades into dugouts, firing bays and side tunnels, then waited a heartbeat for the blasts before jumping into the same sections of earth to clear whatever remained. At the same time, drones hovered above the tree line or slid along it at low level, watching for muzzle flashes and sudden movement that would show where the next threat was hiding. When a Russian position opened fire on the new assault groups, the gun noise and dust gave away its exact spot, and drone operators called in mortars or sent small FPV craft crashing down on that slice of trench. In some clips from the field, viewers can see how a single burst from an enemy rifle is enough to trigger a direct hit from above a few seconds later. This created a deadly rhythm in the tree line, because Ukrainian infantry attacked from the side while machines in the air punished anyone who tried to hold out or shift along the trench. The risk never disappeared, and one Bradley or another armored vehicle could still be struck by a Russian drone, which shows how even modern armor becomes fragile under a sky full of cheap flying bombs. However, once Ukrainian squads had their boots inside the trench system, The core of the fight moved into the soil, where body armor, steady hands, and close teamwork started to matter more than hardware. The combination of smoke, blocking fire, armored transport, grenades, and guided munitions from the air turned this short strip of ground into a live classroom for how 21st century trench warfare really works. For anyone used to images from the First World War, with static lines and slow movement, the speed and layering in this assault show how far the technology and tactics have evolved. Step by step, as more sections of the trench fell under Ukrainian control, Russian groups faced a new choice between staying in shrinking pockets or trying to escape toward the few exits that were still open. That pressure inside the broken tree line set the stage for the final phase of the battle, where some Russian soldiers tried to run and others laid down their weapons. After hours of fighting inside the trees and trenches, the last Russian pockets in that strip were worn down by constant shocks from grenades, bursts from Bradley cannons, and hits from overhead drones. Their positions were smaller, their fields of fire were shorter, and each fresh blast chipped away at the will to stay in place, because no one could be sure where the next strike would land. Other Russian troops did not even make it that far, since some became separated in the confusion, lost sight of their officers, and made instinctive choices to sprint toward any gap that looked clear. A few dropped their weapons and tried to disappear into the woods as individuals, hoping distance and luck would save them where organized defense had failed. Yet more than one group read the situation differently, saw Ukrainian squads closing from both directions, and understood that the trench no longer offered any real way out. Those men raised their hands, stepped out where they could be seen, and signaled that they were willing to surrender rather than die in a corner of a shattered tree line. Ukrainian soldiers moved in carefully, checked for hidden grenades, and then gathered the prisoners in small clusters before marching them back toward the armored vehicles that now dominated the area. Some of the captured Russians were loaded into the back of a Bradley, the same type of vehicle that had rescued Ukrainian troops earlier, and soon the convoy pulled away from the immediate battle zone. For the crews and infantry who had fought through the whole engagement, this mission complete moment showed that the day's work had moved from holding on to actually controlling the contested ground. By the time the firing eased, the tree line and its trench system were once again under Ukrainian control, even though they had briefly fallen into Russian hands during the first shock of the assault. On a map, this might look like a small patch of green and a few black lines, but the ability to take, lose, and then retake such a strip can shape where the enemy can move vehicles or assemble fresh units. Holding that ground can protect a nearby road, shield an artillery position, or block the path of a deeper thrust, so the value lies not only in the soil, but in what it allows or denies in the wider sector. At a larger scale, this kind of fight mirrors what happens day after day around hotspots like Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar, where Russian forces lean on numbers and heavy fire, while Ukraine leans on Western armor, precise guns, and aggressive drone use. For viewers in the United States, scenes like this explain why shipments of Bradleys, M113s, mines, drones, and guided shells matter, because every delivery can change the outcome in one more tree line and keep one more group of soldiers alive to fight another day. At the end of this battle, a narrow strip of forest that had been crushed, seized, and almost lost for good came back under Ukrainian control, thanks to Bradleys, drones, and hard-driving assault teams. From a distance, it looks like a small clash between a few dozen soldiers and a handful of vehicles. Yet when it is placed beside fights around Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar, the pattern of this war becomes clearer. Russian forces lean on massed artillery, mine belts, and a steady flow of infantry backed by cheap unmanned systems, while Ukraine leans on Western armor, smarter use of mines, and flexible tactics that trade space for survival and then strike back. For viewers who study weapons and politics, this tree line fight is a warning that future conflicts will not be dominated only by tank charges across open fields, but by close, violent contests where drones, infantry fighting vehicles, explosives, and small assault groups fight over every trench. If you want more clear, straight talk about battles like this and the politics behind them, like this video, share it, and subscribe to Military Force for deeper frontline analysis.